Hello again. Here is our next rendition of the podcast for America at 250, A History. Today we're going to go a bit longer because we're covering actually a couple of weeks of Joanne's lectures. Joanne Freeman's lectures just ended today with a rousing standing ovation, which is intimidating to the other two of us.
Please keep coming to class.
Yeah, it's not over. The course is not over. America's in big trouble there in the 1830s and 40s, and you got to come back to find out why.
I left them with an ending hanging.
It's very much hanging.
Yeah.
Democracy's
and I kept pointing to you, saying,
"Yeah, well, I know." And maybe I'll sing once. I don't know about Bev, but maybe.
I'm definitely singing.
Okay, good.
You are.
Me too. I got to do.
Oh, I'm so pleased I set that tone then. I can't even
we're going to
you.
back up first to Alexander Hamilton in the course for our students in particular, because they read a lot of Hamilton, his letters, his Federalist essays, his pamphlets, and what an extraordinary, complicated writer he really was. What a complicated personality he was. And we're going to get Joanne, because she is a Hamilton expert, to discuss a fair amount of this. Then we will pick up the 18 teens and into the 20s, westward expansion, Alexis de Tocqueville, the Jacksonian era. And that
so much stuff.
So much great stuff here, and all that chaos of technology and transportation and communication. Joanne, probably the defining issue, at least, of Hamilton's career was this idea of an economic system, this idea of the public credit, about which he wrote a famous document, his quest to create a strong federal government because it needed a bank and it needed a finance system. It needed to create money, and he was steadfast about that. He's going to get into terrible fights over that, of course, with the Jeffersonians. But could we start there? What was this public credit all about to Hamilton?
Sure. And I guess I would say, I'll start off saying it's a two-part answer, which is so historian-esque of me. It's a two-part answer.
It's complicated.
It's complicated.
Actually, my question was probably three parts. So go for it.
Okay. So part of it, maybe 2.5 parts. Part of it is almost expected, which is, in his mind, the model he looked towards was Britain. He says actually, I think even one of the letters that was assigned, that he's going to push this government as close as he can get to that without making it not a republic.
Right. And so, he does refer to America as an empire.
He does refer to America as an empire and refers to the revolution as a civil war. But he's looking towards the old world and towards Great Britain, and that's what he thinks is like what a modern nation looks like. And he's thinking about how the United States needs to stand up on that stage. So part of what he's doing is bolstering the nation so it'll survive, so it'll hang together, and it will be modeled after what he says during the Constitutional Convention is the finest government on the face of the earth, right? Which is what he really believes. But related to this, and less obvious, is when Hamilton talks about credit and national credit, he's also talking about reputation. He's very much talking about the nation's reputation, which is why when you read some of his letters and he says things like, the attacks on our public credit are destroying me and ripping at my soul. And, it's more than just that he's devoted himself to it, that he thinks it's essential for the nation to survive, but also he believes himself to be fighting for the reputation of the nation before the American people, and in his mind, I think importantly, before the world. He also, I think, never really fundamentally believes the thing's going to work. So part of why he's also doing this.
Letters. He's really worried by the late 90s.
He's worried. Well, he leaves the Constitutional Convention thinking it's going to collapse. Yeah. And all the way through, he keeps thinking, I don't know, like I'm going to do everything I can do, but I'm really not sure this is going to hold because it's not strong enough and the people are too powerful, et cetera, et cetera. So that's another part of this is, well, if I can get wealthy people to invest in the government and get them engaged in the government and make it centralized enough so that the will of the people won't quite matter as much as it might.
The enemy is democracy.
He does.
Too much democracy.
So, and that's all of that is how he's acting in his mind to preserve the nation with a model in mind, and because he's just not sure it's actually going to last.
Can we pick up on this word reputation? Because Hamilton's thinking about it in one context with the financial system, the public credit, the image of the United States in the world, but he was a warrior on the question of reputation, both defending his own and ruining others. And that's a big part of the Hamilton story. In some ways, I think now, for a variety of reasons, Hamilton musical. It's one of the things that people know best about him is that kind of personalized politics. And you, of course, have written a great deal about the moments when those questions of reputation and honor become moments of violence, which is a big part of Hamilton's story, too.
Right. So one sort of starting point, which is not just Hamilton, we can move on to why he's like the particular guy, like the poster child for this. But generally speaking, in the 1790s, there is an ongoing assumption for different reasons that it might fall, right? That the next stupid decision we make is going to tank the entire thing. It's going to be gone.
The next foreign policy crisis.
The next, there's one senator who thinks that if he kowtows to George Washington too much, then Washington will think he's a monarch and then it's over. I mean, so they're really that level of concern that this new weird experimental republic thing might not make it means all of the politics in this period are over the top, fractious, nasty, because everyone's operating in this, like, we're going down kind of mentality, which is going to make you put you in that frame of mind when you're operating. So generally speaking, it's a period of dirty, nasty politics. Hamilton, I think partly by nature, he's just a combative guy. Partly because of where he comes from. He's illegitimate. He does not come from wealth. He's from the Caribbean. He's never quite accepted. It's in some of his letters that I assigned for this week, he refers to the United States as your country.
He's not a Puritan and he's not a Southern planter.
No.
He's something in between.
He's what would have been called at the time a mushroom gentleman.
Oh, gosh.
What is a mushroom gentleman?
What's that?
I love it. A mushroom gentleman,
I know.
A mushroom gentleman is someone who springs up from dark, shady, damp places
of course.
And doesn't have roots.
The dark woods.
So real gentlemen, people in the early
that.
Republic, it's the best. Like, people know who you are and they know where your family comes from and you're kind of a little bit of a known quantity. Mushroom gentleman.
So you're like a flower gentleman in that sense, and then you got the mushroom gentleman. Anyway.
Oh, I had never thought of it that way, but you would rather be a flower gentleman than
anyway.
Yes. Trees have roots. That would be big. But so he was in that sense kind of a mushroom gentleman. So I think his sense that he maybe wasn't always fully accepted also helped. So he, over the course of his life, gets involved in 10 affairs of honor, which might be a record for an elite politician. And
Andrew Jackson competed eventually.
He did, but I don't know if he got up to 10.
Okay. You would know.
But at any rate,
There was a lot of murdering, though.
Yeah.
there was way more murdering from Jackson than for Hamilton. But by affair of honor, I mean exchanging ritualized correspondence and essentially talking as though you're going to go to the dueling ground, but then negotiating it so you don't go. So he actually only went to the dueling ground once, and that was the unfortunate time when he died. But if you're that guy who 10 times feels insulted enough to say, my friend will visit your friend and we will take this up in another way, that also says a lot about him personally. And if you put that guy in that political climate, he's a fighter and a warrior, and he's not good at filtering.
He does know he's the leader of a political movement here, though, right? The Federalists. I mean, he's a pol. He calls himself a politician. He's a professional politician.
But that's not...
Intellectual politician.
I don't think they're using the word politician yet. Public man.
I think he used it in a letter or two, but
he might. But that's a problematic. One way in which you can get in a duel is to call somebody a politician.
Yeah, it's not.
It's actually a bad word.
It could be a bad word.
It's not an honored profession.
It is not yet.
If it ever has,
It hasn't even existed yet, and it's already not.
That's right.
Right.
That's exactly it. Wait, where were you? What was the question you just asked me? I've lost my way already.
Was he the head of the Federalist
yes.
movement party?
And
He
were
was.
they a party?
Were they a
is
party?
the
Right.
question
So
of the
this
age,
is the
right?
thing. Yeah.
Right.
So the problem with the word and idea of party is that we bring baggage, right?
Oh.
So we think of a party and we think it's disciplined and organized and
Platforms.
accepted and platforms and structured and all of these things that we assume about parties. And none of those were true in the 1790s. No discipline, no structure, sometimes not even the acknowledgement of it. Depending on what was up for grabs, what's being debated, people would flip all over the map on different issues. Hamilton would say, we need to call a vote on X so I can actually see who agrees with me. You know, it's a different world. So I usually refer to partisan alliances. And along with that, he is the head for a while of the Federalists, but what the Federalists are referred to for a while are the particular friends of Mr. Hamilton.
Okay, that says a lot.
Exactly.
It's a very personalized political movement.
Yeah, exactly. And the particular friends of Mr. Jefferson. So,
right.
And do you want to say something about what the anxiety? So it wasn't just that parties didn't exist.
Right.
It was that there was a sense that this was going to take the country in a wrong direction.
Right.
One word is faction. We've mentioned that before. But it's almost as if people couldn't imagine parties as they come to exist pretty quickly in the 19th century, actually. But also that they have a ready-made critique, even before the parties exist, about why a party system would be so damaging.
They're dangerous.
well, they're dangerous, particularly in a republic. Mm-hmm. So the republic is experimental. The world is monarchies. And they're thinking, okay, we're creating this nation that's kind of grounded on people coming together and thinking about the general good. And of course, they're going to argue and there's going to be conflict and there's going to be all the normal things you expect in politics. But in the end, a republic is grounded on the idea that people are going to be able to come together and sort of find a path that makes everyone at least not quite entirely miserable. Political parties are groups of people looking out for themselves. So the idea of a political party,
factions.
Yeah, that in and of itself,
what you're warned about in about
it
a
slaps.
third of the Federalist essays.
Right. It slaps at what they're hoping for in the Republic. So they don't assume that there are going to be organized parties, and they throw names at each other saying, they're a party, we represent the public and they represent themselves, both sides saying that about the other. So party is a dangerous thing and a self-interested thing. And there's a reason why when Thomas Jefferson becomes president, his inaugural address is, we are all Federalists, we are all Republicans. That horrible stuff is gone, and now we will all be together again. So
Nice try, Tom.
I know, he did. At least he said it anyway.
Listen, before we leave this question, though, go up to 20,000 feet here,
Uh-oh.
Madam Historian, and make a judgment. Why do you think this fledgling republic, given all this bit, we think we're polarized today? These people were polarized. And by the way, we are polarized today. But
We think correctly that we're
why do you think this republic did survive up to 1800, and then even that 1800 election, which was a true crisis?
interesting.
Into the two terms of Jefferson and so on. Why did it? If you have to explain,
From 2,000
that.
feet.
Yeah.
So one thing that's an interesting part of the answer is that on the one hand, they thought it could collapse. They thought that their opponents were horrible, self-interested, bad people who were going to take it all down. But on some fundamental level, I think certainly we're talking about the sort of elite politicos, assumed that everyone probably didn't want it to crash and burn. And the way that you can see that is like in the election of 1800, which almost resorts to, there's almost violence and the government's going to be seized for, a federalist, or they're going to stop a president from being elected, and people are arming in two states.
They
and
almost have January 6th.
Exactly. And it's a horrible thing. But when you look at the correspondence of people in the midst of it, they'll say things like, they're talking about like stealing the presidency and arming themselves and coming after us. And there's always someone who says, they wouldn't really do that, would they? There's that factor, which is horrible things could happen, but really?
Does it have something to do with they all had achieved this revolution?
Yeah.
Despite themselves? And they just can't let it fail?
Well, and there's a sense of a sort of really sort of fundamental we of people engaged in that project. And they disagree about what it is or what it should be and who should be in it and every other kind of thing. But I think there's a kind of fundamental assumption that, well, we've all been kind of doing this together. We're talking about the elite guys. We've all been kind of doing this together. Are they really going to do this thing? I
could feel that in some of Hamilton's letters by the 90s and even after around 1800, that crisis. And in so many of those letters, he was writing mostly to his friends, it's what's at stake. Everything we've created, the Constitution, the Revolution.
Which they all believe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But if we can't stop so-and-so, if we can't stop him, then the revolution will fail.
Right.
But so they could hate each other in many cases and yet still try to preserve their vision of this revolution.
Well, the revolution will fail, and they all, the sort of leading, what I always call the major leaguers versus the minor leaguers of the political elite, their lives and careers and reputations are entirely attached to the fate.
And their fortunes.
And their fortunes are attached to the fate of what happens. You know, some of them know in some degree that they're founders of a sort. So that's built into this too, that it's not even just the revolution, but they all, on a certain level, believe like they are part of this experiment and it really matters. And what happens to it, you know, will be, Hamilton has all the language in the first paragraph of the first Federalist essay about how this will be a, you know, tragedy for humankind if we fail. But I think there is a sort of assumption, a belief on their part. And actually, I'm sure we're going to sort of come back to some of this when we talk about Tocqueville a little down the line, but there is an assumption that they're trying this grand experiment and that none of them really wants it to fail.
Well, one of my favorite pieces from your lectures these last couple of weeks has been getting to know George Washington a little better, right? George Washington, who often seems like this very reserved, very formal character, right? Heroic in his own way, much pilloried for being a large-scale slaveholder. And you made him really human in these interesting ways as he's saying, oh my gosh, you know, I'm the dog that caught the car. Now I've got to do this thing. And what do I do with it? So those wonderful documents that you showed in which he's going through the Constitution and writing president in the margin. Like, this is what I'm supposed to do. My other favorite anecdote or really set of experiences from that period is George Washington going on his road trip, right? When he decides that he is going to have to figure out what America is, and the way he's going to do that is by going out and trying to see it, hanging out with ordinary people, letting them do declamations and songs for him, you know, making a special trip to Rhode Island once it comes on board.
Once it comes into the Union.
Right. Yeah. And so, you know, in many ways, he's sort of our original road tripper. We're going to get to de Tocqueville, but he's setting a model not only for a kind of public man, but for how you get to know what this country actually is.
Well, there's a flip side to that, too, because he, during the Revolution, already is marching around and getting a sense of things. Part of what he's doing, to many people, he represents the government. So he's showing people that there is a government and he is the government. And by putting himself in different places, he's sending a message. So I would say more of what he's doing is making pronouncements. Signaling people. Because he, you know, to a greater degree than a lot of people, he doesn't love what he sees when he becomes commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. He says New Englanders are an exceedingly dirty and nasty people. But he does get a sense of the nation then. But, you know, some people, to many people sort of, you know, who weren't in the middle of a city, they thought he was the government. And
then there's the farewell address. And I noticed in the documents Hamilton's draft. Hamilton wrote?
Washington asked him to try his hand at it. Well, Madison pitched in too.
Okay. Oh, okay. Okay. But there it is, this long draft by Hamilton. He took his turn.
Yeah.
There's the beginning of presidents needing speechwriters.
Well, that's true.
And GW no doubt needed one for this.
GW was
one.
not very skilled with words on paper. She
Those
said
were very
diplomatically.
funny quotes that you had in lecture of his. He's the original kind of bureaucratic speaker in some sense. Before we actually leave Washington as he heads to Virginia, I want you to talk a little bit more about someone named Ona Judge, and you said a little bit about her experiences in lecture when you talked about when Washington lived in Philadelphia, which became the national capital, and the state of Pennsylvania had this 6-month law, which said if you were an enslaved person brought into the state, you could petition for emancipation after 6 months. So maybe we'll get to Ona Judge herself in a minute, but tell us a little bit more about what Washington did in that situation, how he thought about that, and what that tells us about, you know, not only Washington's own contradictions, but you said he wanted to embody the nation. Okay, here he is embodying the nation.
In ways he didn't intend, but that are very true. No, you're totally right. So, you know, there he is as president, well aware that the enslaved people that he has brought with him to the presidential mansion in Philadelphia after 6 months aren't necessarily going to be enslaved to him. And so he
by law. It's a Pennsylvania law.
Right. No, that's it. So he very carefully finds ways to basically send them out, to send them back to Mount Vernon, and then bring them back so that they will not have been in Philadelphia for 6 months. And there are, I think I read a letter in which he says something like, well, you know, Mrs. Washington's going back to Mount Vernon, and she could take them with her, and then they can come back, you know. And so very clearly he's finding ways to maintain his hold on these enslaved people as he is representing the nation, talking about the Republic, you know, it's sort of we are a new kind of government. We are new world, not old world. And one of the reasons why I thought it was important to include that is precisely because of the Washington on a pedestal problem. That very fact that this figure who at the time and ever after has been held up as like Washington, you know, Washington, the person with principles and whatever else. He's also the guy who's being very careful about preserving his enslaved his grip on enslaved people. And to me, that fact kind of encapsulated some of the contradictions that are at the absolute heart of who we are as a nation, the paradoxes and the conflicts. George Washington, who's George Washington, and George Washington is also a slaveholder who's trying really hard to keep his slaves. So I don't know, certainly for the purposes of this class, I thought it would be irresponsible not to highlight that conflict.
And aren't we trying to convey here that pedestals or not, everybody's full of contradiction in this story. George Washington, depending on how you define a monument, still has the tallest monument in the United States. It's called the Washington Monument. But there are many sides to all of these men, all these people.
Well, and that's the important part is that they're
absolutely.
people.
That's what history is.
Yeah.
Back to Hamilton, at least one last time. This is a very complicated, driven personality, brilliant, wordsmith in his own way. But my God, messy life. That Reynolds pamphlet, as it's called, quite a document. He gets caught, and he has an affair with the wife of a man named Reynolds. And
then pays blackmail to keep it undercover.
Pays blackmail. But that pamphlet has fascinating passages about the nature of lies. I mean, he's accusing everybody of lies against him. At the same time, the whole half of that document is his confession that this happened. He calls it his indelicate amour, which, you know, later American politicians should have quoted him on that one.
It's delicate.
It's indelicate. But it's full of his persecution complex, too. Everyone's out to kill him, destroy him, get him.
But sometimes they are.
And they are. But doesn't he then...
Conspiracies are real.
Yeah, sometimes they are. And you know, before we get you to comment on the duel, those last years for him seem pretty dark times. He's kind of withdrawn himself to some degree from politics, although he's constantly writing about it and constantly telling other Federalists what they should do and not do. He's writing diatribes against John Adams and, of course, worse than diatribes against Aaron Burr. So give us this. Who is Hamilton in those last few years of this tragic life? Young man still.
I started studying Hamilton when I was 14 and reading his published papers, the 27 volumes of his published papers. And I think at that age, what grabbed me was he was so flawed. He so often
interesting.
did things he shouldn't do and did things that even to me at that age, I was like, really? And even just dueling, right? How did that make sense? So he is a person who is profoundly flawed and not good at filtering. And so he's like loud and bold about being flawed and gets into trouble time and time and time again. So that's really interesting. Now,
Not afraid to hate.
Not afraid to hate. So there's two things. So the one thing is, what happens in those last couple of years is if you're that guy and you've been giving like all your energy and all your passion and all of your life to a vision of America as you want it to be, and then you suddenly see in the election of 1800, that's not happening. Mm-hmm. That the nation shifts in a Jeffersonian Republican direction, which means it's going to be more comfortable with a more democratic politics. And, it's why he said it's a striking thing for someone who's given all of his life to this experiment to say in his last few years, this American world was not meant for me. He just understands and sees and doesn't like the fact that democracy is taking a role in the nation that he didn't necessarily see it taking.
So forget almost everything you learned about history in the musical Hamilton. Love the glorious hip-hop rendition of the Founders. It's fantastic, but be careful with the history in there. So why'd the duel happen?
The duel happened because Hamilton saw Aaron Burr as being particularly dangerous because Burr
and he
to
wrote
Hamilton
that down over and over
again. To Hamilton, Burr had no set principles. Burr was an opportunist, and Burr was as ambitious as Hamilton was, but didn't have anything to rein him in. So although they were friendly and they shared court cases and,
He said he had no theory.
He had no theory. He had no plan.
Except himself.
And that was how Hamilton saw it. And others understood that about Burr because in this age, actually around 1800, 1801, when people are for the first time like, this is like a close contest. We got a election of 1800. We have to figure things out. There were Federalists who said, well, I like Burr because he has no theory. He has no principle. There's nothing holding him back. And that's really useful in politics.
They used to say that later in the 19th century about some Republicans because, as it was said of Rutherford B. Hayes, he was obnoxious to no one. And that was a compliment.
Although that's Burr, too. Burr was charming to everybody, too.
Till he wasn't.
Well, yeah. I was going to say, until now. But the reason is because Hamilton continually, at one point he said he considered it his religious duty to oppose Burr's career. That's his language. Because Burr, in his mind, was just immoral and dangerous about the American experiment. So whenever Burr ran for something or wanted something, Hamilton jumped right in and said, nope. So that happens in 1800, but then it happens a couple of years later again, in which he jumps out and says, Burr's running for office in New York, and Hamilton says, no, like this guy shouldn't be given office. But in this last moment, this last occasion, someone actually... So Hamilton at a dinner party said something despicable about Aaron Burr. And someone...
Imagine that.
I know,
just
shocking.
off the cuff.
And someone wrote this down in a letter.
Tell you the ways, how much I hate Aaron Burr.
And said something like, you should have been at that party. Hamilton said that Burr wasn't fit for the reins of government and said a few things even more despicable that I won't put in writing because mail gets stolen all the time. And the letter gets stolen and Burr gets given that.
They needed signal.
So, right, he's like, oh, they did need signal. Clearly, he's given the piece of paper. And all of these people have been destroying his career. And now he's like, oh, I now have someone who's been slandering me, and it's Hamilton, even better. So he uses that and feels he has to do that to preserve his political career.
Wow.
So before I see David's holding on to
we
democracy in America there, and I think we want to get to Tocqueville
Yes.
And get to the 1820s and 1830s. I wanted to finish out the story of Ona Judge, since we brought up her name. And I will just say first that it's a very dramatic story. And secondly, I think it's importantly representative of something that starts to happen in this whole period, as you've suggested, which is that people start to take up the revolutionary legacy, take up the language and idea and frameworks of freedom
to own
and make it their own. So Ona Judge was one of the enslaved people brought to Philadelphia with George Washington. She was one of the people circulated in and out. She had been born in Mount Vernon into slavery, and she had become, as a very young girl, a personal servant to Martha Washington. But when she was brought to Philadelphia, she got to see a whole new world. Philadelphia had a very powerful anti-slavery tradition already in the 1780s, and it had a very large free Black population. And Ona Judge looked around that city and said, hey, I see freedom. And so before she could be brought back to Mount Vernon, when George Washington was heading back after the presidency, she walked out the door, went north, settled in New Hampshire, and became a free woman and kind of defined American freedom for herself under great constraints. And Washington continued to go after her and try to get her back.
Kept trying to get her.
He sent all of these emissaries to get her and harass her.
Which shows you the degree to which this was a matter of principle as well as property for him.
Well, it was lost property for sure.
Well, and he was embarrassed, right? Because this was publicly known. And she wins, more or less, in the end, though it's extremely difficult to make a living and survive and prosper under the conditions in which she was living. But so her story I just find fascinating in its own right, but I think it also tells us something about where we're going into the early 19th century, where all of these frameworks and ideas and language, liberty and freedom and the Constitution and the Declaration, all these new groups and all these new movements start to pick them up and say, hey, that's ours, right? The Cherokee do that. They have a constitution. They set up a kind of model republic. It works for a little while and then doesn't actually prevent Indian removal. Lots of other groups are doing this too. The abolitionists invent the Liberty Bell.
But this is
a great symbol.
This is part of what I talked about when I talked about the Declaration of Independence, because obviously, you look at that, all men are created equal, and you're like, yeah, right, sure. Like, even at the time, they didn't believe it. But in a way, the most important aspect of that, as you're suggesting here, is that it's on paper and it's claimable as a fundamental American ideal, which means marginalized people and repressed people can point to that and say, yeah, actually, those are my rights. I have those rights. So it becomes a vital tool and a way in which people can get beyond the limitations of the founding in all of the ways that you're describing.
There's an African-American historian named Benjamin Quarles, now long deceased, who said way back in the 50s in an essay that no one refused to allow America to de-revolutionize the revolution as did Black Americans, meaning they appropriated that language, the creeds. And by the way, it's great that you told the story of Ona Judge. She's now, because of some recent research, one of our most famous early fugitive slaves. She was hardly the first.
Dunbar. It's a great book. Never caught.
Never caught. And, of course, there will be thousands upon thousands more into the 19th century, and they will become one of the most contested questions in American politics.
I also want to just mention for folks that in Philadelphia, there is I don't want to call it a monument, but it's somewhere between a monument and a site on where the former presidential mansion was, that actually is about the enslaved people who were in the presidential mansion, that I believe is getting some attention now.
It is, because the National Park Service is being challenged about some of its exhibitions.
Correct. But I wanted to bring it up so that people could go and see it, because this issue is so important, and it's amazing and wonderful that it's there.
Indeed. Well, so a French aristocrat named Alexis de Tocqueville, who was already quite famous as a writer, kind of a philosophical sociologist, among other things, comes to America in 1831, stays a little over 9 months, travels all over the country with his sidekick, Gustave Beaumont, and writes perhaps the most famous travel book, 2 volumes, at least by the 1830s, about America, although it's a genre that's really growing. So we had our students read at least an excerpted version of Democracy in America. Tocqueville found these Americans astonishing. He came ostensibly to observe America's prison system because there was all sorts of reform supposedly going on in American prisons. But he interviewed all sorts of people. He traveled all over the country. Well, he traveled about as much as one could in 9 months. And he came up with just dozens and dozens of lasting observations about Americans in the United States circa the 1830s. What did you two feel this time in reading this? I've taught it many times. You have. What did you not just feel, but what did you think came forth as most poignant here? Observations about this America of roughly 1830.
I actually want to touch on why I assigned it, which is part of the answer to your question.
Sure.
I assigned it because, and it screams out from the text, it's an outsider looking in. And over the course of American history, there are French visitors who come in the 1790s to the United States and say things like, well, it's interesting what's going on there, but there's a lot of, quote unquote, British rust left in their system, right? So people from the outside see things that people
thought we were all just farmers.
Right.
Good farmers.
People from the outside see things in a fascinating way. And this is such a brilliant, both sort of internal and sweeping way of looking at the United States right at the period where the course has gotten to at this point that is about people and not really just about the United States. It's about democracy in America, but in a way it's about democratic Americans in America more than anything else. So that is, if you are not reading along with the course, I encourage you to look at this, because looking at how an outsider who comes to the United States, partly he's looking for prison reform because that was a big deal in the United States, but wanting to understand how American democracy worked and then putting that in these volumes, trying to figure that out, that's an amazing thing to leave behind. It was amazing at the time, but for anyone trying to get a historical grasp on this, it's amazing.
And he writes, go ahead, Bev.
Well, I was just going to say I had 2 reactions to reading it. One was a deep sense of identification, because I have just finished writing my own American road trip book in which I have gone around the country, mainly to historic sites, and tried to figure out how we tell our history tells us about who we are now, since we're about to hit the 250th anniversary of the Declaration. America at 250, that's where we're heading. So I was thinking about him and identifying with him strongly in that sense. And then what I found really striking this time is that we tend to have this kind of glowing view of what democracy in America means. There he is, and Americans are doers, and they're joining civic associations.
You can hear the choir in the
background,
right?
There are all these sort of famous quotes. But actually, he really is pretty ambivalent about all of this. And the passages that I found the funniest this time around were his portraits of this American population as a bunch of basically money-grubbing, self-interested, individualistic simpletons, right? That they're
bragging,
boring,
impatient.
They're never going to have any interesting ideas again. They have no good intellectuals anymore because everybody's kind of the same. And you can feel his aristocratic leanings and his love of the sort of eccentric aristocrat in there. And he clearly has some story in which Americans are all just a bunch of middle-class peasants, essentially.
But you know what I love about that, even above and beyond the Tocqueville-ness of it, is the United States does what it does and has this sense that they're, an experiment for the world and a new pure form of government and not corrupt and, again, like the choir, holy choir singing about what's going to happen. And what we have is people like Tocqueville and others who are curious because they hear that and they want to see if it's true.
And he finds a lot of contradictions.
Well, everyone does.
He writes about it,
right?
sure
I mean, Charles Dickens comes and he's like, "Wow, I want to see democracy." And he writes a letter when he's here and says, I don't have the language that he uses, but he's like, "I'm so disappointed. Yeah. It's not what I thought." They find mediocrity, and even more than that, they don't see what they wanted to see, which is what they imagined democracy could be, which is how Americans talk about it.
Right.
I find that really poignant, that people come kind of hoping to see what it's being suggested is there, and they're all disappointed because it's not what they've been led to believe is there.
And as we said, there are lots of travelers. There are lots of people doing this from lots of different places, from Mexico, from elsewhere. One of them, who came in the 1820s, actually right before de Tocqueville, that de Tocqueville would have been thinking about and knowing about, is the Marquis de Lafayette. And he is particularly interesting because he was there in the Revolution, right? He knew that generation. He knew Washington. He comes back for this grand tour.
Yeah.
Exactly.
He's the hero everyone wants to meet.
Exactly. He's the nation's guest. He's feted wherever he goes. He certainly enjoys himself, and his companion writes a travelogue about all of this, but he is shocked at the ways in which Americans are violating what he thought he was doing in the Revolution, particularly on the question of slavery. And he brags about going around to the founding generation, the few of them that are still alive, and saying, what? What are you doing? This was not the plan. And in fact, things are much worse. And the same thing for the treatment of indigenous peoples. He's quite shocked and surprised to see the reality on the ground compared to what he thought
and
that he was fighting for.
Tocqueville is also shocked. When he crosses the Ohio River, there's this famous, incredible passage where he says, even labor is different here on the other side of the Ohio. It's denigrated. Everything is slower. It's dirtier, and so on and so on. And he's only 2.5, 3 weeks in the South. He travels fast through the South, but he's very disappointed, to say the least, about slavery, and he all but predicts a kind of race war eventually. He doesn't predict civil war as much as he predicts struggle, conflict between the races. He's very troubled by that, and yet he's also very impressed by some of the more elite people he meets in the cities. And there's a grudging admission in Tocqueville too that I've always appreciated. These Americans really do stun him by their mobility and their energy and their productivity. There's another famous
by the fact that they're willing to work all the time.
Yeah, they work all the time.
Is really a major theme in here.
Boy, you wasn't wrong about that either, was he? We still take fewer vacations than any people on earth for successful countries.
I want to grab at part of what you're saying, and it also relates back to Ona Judge and Washington and enslaved people, and that is what we're talking about again and again and again, and I've been striking at it in one way or another in a lot of my lectures, and that is on the one hand, there's the striving and the goals and the ideals and the ideas that deserve to be recognized, and on the other hand, there are all of the ways in which they were ignored and neglected and violated, and that's reality. Right? That's America. And you can't tell the pretty story without what was happening all around the pretty story. And it's the contradictions inherent in those things banging up against each other that ends up being who we are.
And we're not teaching this course to give everybody a pleasing adventure into the joys and triumphs of the American past. We're teaching about real history. It's one of the I think values of reading Tocqueville, because he sees these contradictions.
Well, and just doing, I think, and I can't wait to hear what you guys are going to do, because now I get to sit in the audience. But the fact that we are talking about and acknowledging the ideals and goals, and then the ugly realities, and actually appreciating and acknowledging these things with full force at the same time, that's, I sort of feel like it's very easy to look at like part of our conversation today talking about Tocqueville and say, well, you're all just making America look bad in this time period, grumble, grumble, grumble. It's like, well, on the one hand, yes. On the other hand, America was striving for something more. He was interested to see if it was there or not. And both of those parts matter.
And one of the reasons that de Tocqueville has lasted for so long and is one of everyone's favorite people to quote is precisely because he does get at this set of contradictions and dilemmas and hopes and fears. And so pretty much everyone can cherry pick their de Tocqueville quote and
that's
use
true with
it
every
in the
founder
ways that
too.
they want. Yes.
That's true with Hamilton even.
In fact, I found myself going through and being like, that one's useful, and that one's useful,
absolutely.
and I'm going to pull that one out.
Well, how about the one where America looks like forever a suburb? In 1831? Or the one where Americans move all the time and then they move again before they put the roof on their house? Mobility, mobility, mobility. We're not as mobile now as we used to be, but there are all kinds of recognitions in Tocqueville. There's a reason, folks out there, that if you haven't read Alexis de Tocqueville, any edition, and the full 2 volumes, gets very thick.
I thought this one. Let's do some de Tocqueville quote pulling here.
All right.
I always tell my students when I'm reading drafts of their papers, I always say, don't quote strings. So don't just pull one quote after another.
Because then you vanish in your paper and it's a bunch of...
we lose you, we lose your voice. But I want to do some quote stringing and quote pulling now. One that spoke to me in new ways toward the end, in the edition that we are looking at on page 164, I thought was a really interesting sort of preview of social isolation in his moment as he understood it, some of the downsides of individualism, right? So today, so many people are talking about loneliness and fracture and social isolation. And he says that of Americans, each of them standing alone is a stranger to the destiny of the others. For each of them, his own children and friends comprise the whole human race. Each lives with his fellow citizens but doesn't see them. He touches them and feels nothing. He exists in himself and for himself alone. And though he may retain his family, one would have to say he has lost his country. And that really resonated with me as this sort of mournful understanding of what a new set of communications technologies, a new speed of life, new forms of mobility.
The spreading
hyper-individualism,
of the nation, right.
All of those things. And you spoke about that so well in lecture today, just this surfeit of changes that's happening at all these different levels, the kind of confusion and anxiety that it produces. But that passage somehow captured for me some of the...
It's the individual human feeling of it, right? Yeah. Which is powerful.
And the individualism, it's one of the most famous sections of Tocqueville is his observations about American individualism. And if you ask most Americans with a modicum of education, what's a feature of the American character, maybe individualism would still come, where he says, Americans are so caught in their individualism that they are trapped in the habits of their own heart. He wasn't wrong about that. And we've never quite overcome that, have we? Anyway, Tocqueville goes back to France. He writes 2 volumes about America, calls it Democracy in America. The first was published, I think, 1835, another one later in the 1830s. And to this day, everybody his own or her own Tocquevillian. But then we go into the 1820s and 1830s into something still in textbooks that gets called the Age of Jackson, although those are fighting words in some parts of our profession. It's an age of many things. It's an age of massive expansion. It's an age of Indian removal. It's an age of incredible expansion of slavery across the South.
Jefferson Jackson put his stamp on those things.
There's no question he did. So how? What is the Jackson stamp on this era from really the early 1820s, or even from the Battle of New Orleans, if you like, at the end of the War of 1812, all the way through the 1830s?
Jackson, I guess capitalizes is really the right word. Jackson takes advantage of, knowingly in some ways and just partly because of who he is, he's like the man for that moment. He's a different kind of leader. He is more Western. He's less educated. He's focused on the common man. He's really the first president that's who he's there. He's there for the common man. And he has Martin Van Buren helping him actually create what we don't have in that early period, as we talked about before, which is actual organized politics. And I talked about this. A real party. I talked about this in the lecture, that you can't realize the degree to which having a real party that you're in, and it's like you're in a club and you can see where you can rise in the party, and the party's in place. So if you need to do something at network or national, poof, it's there. I mentioned this in the lecture because it's such a striking comparison. Jefferson in 1799 desperately wants to get a pamphlet out. He's looking ahead at the election of 1800, and he can't figure out. He's like, so who do we know? Are there clubs? How can we? He cannot figure out. And I, in my work on the 1790s, when people want to distribute something, like there's a guy in Virginia who travels all the way to Richmond to have multiple copies of a political pamphlet printed, and then he stays in Richmond waiting for people heading west and gives them 10 copies. He's like, could you please take 10?
And
that's it. Now, if you think about the degree to which you're trying to in a spread out republic in which democracy and the people are increasingly feeling like my voice matters, and you can't actually do anything, you can see why a party, for personal reasons for Americans, but also for purely strategic political reasons, really takes off.
By the time of Jackson and his party, they have a thing called the rotary press, and pretty soon
steam-powered printing presses.
Yeah. Which enables daily newspapers and wider distribution. And this is going to change everything. It's going to change the reform movement. It's going to change politics. It's going to change information.
Where it's going to leak into your lectures, right? Because part of what it does, all of this building up, these connections and the railroad and the telegraph and all of these ways in which people are connecting better than before, are happening as the sectional crisis is rising. So ironically, something that you would think is a good thing, like, hey, it's uniting the nation as never before, at a moment when the nation is really—
the internet was going to democratize everything.
Well, at that moment, like at some point in my most recent book, I talk about how it was possible for Franklin Pierce to run as an anti-slavery person and a pro-slavery person at the same time for a while.
Depending on where it
was, and the fact that there wasn't the kind of communication that could make that impossible.
They'll still be doing that with William Howard Taft in the early 20th century.
But you have to try harder.
Yeah, that's true.
You have to try harder. So my point is just
the
nationalization and spread, which sounds like it should be a good thing. If you're talking about sectional conflict and ultimately what's going to divide a nation in two and lead to bloodshed and death, nationalization is a problem.
I do want to preview that some of what you've been talking about in terms of political structures in particular is obviously going to continue to evolve. But when we get into the 20th century, we're going to be talking not just about this founding party system, but about the reinventions of the party system that happen once, the idea of parties gets settled pretty fast. We're going to have them. We're stuck with them. But they are constantly being reinvented. Jackson is really our first age of president who comes along, right? So historians love to sort of say every 40, 50 years, we get the new age of. And so we're heading into many more age ofs that, like Jackson, are incredibly contested. Is it really the age of Roosevelt? Is it really the age of Reagan? But that framework and that way of talking about things, we're gonna get there in the 20th century.
And I want to
take some of that apart.
I've been trying really hard, and I'm saying this because you folks who are watching this can judge. I've been trying really hard in my big 8 lectures, not just to sort of get at all of the history that's bound up in those decades, which is not easy, but to put in place themes and ideas that it seems to me are you guys are going to want to pick up on just in the way that you just said.
Let's pick up one of those because you addressed it today in today's lecture.
You can give us a preview of where we're going because David Blight is on deck.
Yeah, right.
Tuesday.
I'm warming up.
Tuesday.
But massive social change to every element of American society. Not only are they expanding, then I have all kinds of new technology. The telegraph revolutionizes communication. It's kind of odd to think back. Who even knows that Western Union still exists? It actually does. But the railroad is going to revolutionize everything, including time.
Well, like I talked about today, it changed the understanding of time.
Absolutely. Gave us time zones, et cetera, et cetera. It meant now the age of machines. And it meant mechanization. This is going to be, I may do 2 minutes on this in the lecture. It meant an age now of patents. And the Federal Patent Office became one of the most powerful places anywhere. Because if you could make an addition to that Reaper and make it work better, you got a patent. And you got a lot of money when you got a patent. And everybody's trying to invent something and create something to change technology, mechanization, farm equipment, everything. But it's also going to make possible the intensification of conflict, which is your point. You got a big problem in society over race and gender and women who want their rights and the right to vote. You got a gigantic problem over slavery. What's the future going to be? Free labor, slave labor? Now you can spread that wide. No one ever used the technology of the printing press quite as effectively as abolitionists.
It's true.
But
you know what popped into my head?
Out.
What pops into my head as you're talking is when I talk about the 18th century, late 18th century, I talk about it as an age when people felt that the most exciting new things that we've ever seen before, and there's experiments, was politics, right? Revolution politics, and people were very much focused on that. That was where the excitement was. Then we're talking about a period where technology, like who knows what's going to come along next, and people are going to communicate, and it's going to be so different. And now we're having a communication moment, right? Which is partly social media and partly the internet, and now we're getting into AI and everything else. In a similar kind of a way, at any given day, we can believe that there's some weird new communication mode that on the one hand is like, wow, that's interesting. Wait a minute, I don't like that idea so much. That you can see these different kinds of moments when something comes along. Talk about age of, the age of revolution, the age of mechanization, and then the age of new forms of communication. It's a really interesting way to see.
Now, back then, some people retreated from all of this. They retreated into utopian communities.
Yeah, I talked about utopian communities.
They retreated into different kinds of retreats from the vast changes surrounding them.
You know what happened to one of Hamilton's sons? He retreated, I believe it was was it Wyoming? Oh, wow. He went all the way out west into some isolated area and in a cabin.
This is in what decade? 20s, 30s?
No, later. It's got to be like the 30s.
Yeah, there was no Wyoming yet.
Yeah, no, I was going to say 30s, 40s. I can't remember, and it might not be Wyoming. It's out there.
Right.
And he has like a cabin and lives there by himself, and it becomes known as Hamilton's Diggins, as that area. But he's doing some of what you're talking about here.
That's a movie, man. The Hamilton son.
You know who wanders out there to see him is aged Elizabeth Hamilton.
Oh my God.
Gets in a carriage and is like, I'm going to see my son.
Well, I want to say that if any of you out there thinking about someplace to go for fall break as part of my travels for this book that I was writing about, I went and spent the night in the Oneida Commune, which is one of these
I almost talked about that today.
19th century communes. Yeah. It's one of the wackier ones.
It is pretty strange.
They got rich because they spun off this flatware company named Oneida. So you surely in your lifetimes have eaten off of
this was Noyes,
Oneida
right?
Yeah. So this was
Noyes, yeah.
John Humphrey Noyes, I believe is his full name. And he went to the middle of New York, like many people did along the Erie Canal in the 1840s, and founded this quite strange, quite sex-obsessed utopian commune with its own rules of reproduction and
and the older people should procreate with the younger people.
How you were supposed to engage. So there's a lot of complicated stuff, but it still exists, and it actually has part of it that is now a public hotel, and you can go stay in a 19th century commune.
And then there were the Shakers, who had an entirely different take on reproduction.
I have to say, the degree to which
They were
I could only.
experimenting.
Well, I know, but
an
I could
Asian
only talk about
experiment.
one because
Right.
I only had like 50 minutes.
Well, I think the thing that I took away from your lecture about all of this is the idea of perfectibility, which becomes so important not only in American religion during this period, right? That you can perfect yourself, you can perfect the nation. It's quite different, actually, from what the founders were talking about when they talked about politics. They were all about checks and balances. Nobody's perfect, so we've got to
We'll make a
have
more
all
perfect
these
union, but
cautions.
we'll never make it
More
perfect.
perfect, but not perfect. Yeah.
But by the 1820s and 30s, people are starting to think that you can make perfection in yourself and therefore you
Well.
can perfect your country. And that's going to drive a lot of reform movements from this moment
Terrific
on.
point. And yet, like all reform movements and any claim of perfection, it caused a tremendous reaction, especially in the pro-slavery South, where a lot of pro-slavery writers thought these perfectionists were totally crazy,
Well, yeah.
like lunatics.
I think you should give us a preview of where,
Well, here's a
we're
preview.
going with all of this.
Here's a preview for you
David
with
Blight.
no numbers. In the 4 general elections before the American Civil War, we had the largest voter turnouts in all of American history. Why? We'll let you know.
Ooh, excellent cliffhanger. I love
Largest
that.
voter turnouts in all of American history. Why?
All right. You
Okay.
have to tell us.
Okay.
Tune in.
We will tune in
Okay.
next week.
next time.
Tune in next week at the lecture and next week for the podcast. And I'll be in the hot seat next week
Yeah.
for the next 4 of these or so. You guys get to have at me. Woo! I don't know. That's a tough chair over there. Well, thank you for listening and watching the podcast of America at 250,
America at 250.
All History. At some point, I'll remember the name of this course. And we'll look forward to next time. Thank you.
I also want to say briefly,
Joanne, your last moment in that
That's it.
chair. Yes. go
thank
for it.
you all, for those of you who've been watching.
Yes.
Thank you all for watching and for thinking. I guess I didn't really officially say this at the end of my last lecture, but it has been the most fun and the biggest privilege to talk to this audience about these topics at this time, and this gives me the opportunity to thank
Well,
folks
and
for tuning in.
if Bev and I don't blow it, we'll hopefully say that by the end of the course. So, again, thank you all for watching and listening, and see you next time.